A soldier and his loyal German shepherd K9 were walking home from a late shift on a stormy night. John kept his head down, the rain soaking through his jacket, determined to get home without stopping for anything. But Ranger suddenly froze, ears pricked, and bolted into the darkness. With a reluctant sigh, John followed, ready to drag the dog back, until he saw her. A little girl in a torn red shirt, drenched and shivering, kneeling beside an unconscious woman on the wet pavement. He was going to walk past. He really was. But then the girl looked up, clutching her backpack tighter, and whispered through trembling lips, "Please, help my mom. She can't wake up." Those words cut through the roar of the rain, and John knew something was terribly wrong. What happened next will break your heart, and then piece it back together. The rain fell in relentless sheets over Maple Hollow, Pennsylvania, painting the small town in blurred lines of gray and silver. Wind slithered through the bare trees, rattling the last stubborn leaves like brittle bones. It was the kind of night where the streets emptied early, doors locked, and curtains drawn. John Miller walked along the slick sidewalk, shoulders hunched under his old Navy work jacket. At 47, his frame was still broad from his years in the Army, but softened now by long shifts at the auto repair shop. His hair was cut short, the steel gray color blending with the stubble along his jaw. Deep lines carved his face, the kind that came from both sun-scorched battlefields and sleepless nights alone. He didn't like crowds anymore, not since Iraq. The war had trained him to notice every sound, every shadow, but also left him tired of being around people who didn't understand silence. Tonight, all he wanted was to get home, heat the leftover chili in his fridge, and maybe share a quiet hour with the only living thing he trusted without hesitation: Ranger. Ranger trotted a few paces ahead, his 6-year-old German shepherd frame solid and purposeful. His black and tan coat shimmered in the rain, and his ears were tuned to every rustle, every shift in the night. He had served as a K9 alongside John overseas, trained to detect explosives, track, and protect. Even in retirement, he carried himself with a soldier's discipline, though when the two of them were alone, he became the gentle shadow who pressed close during John's worst nights. They turned down a side street that cut past the park, a shortcut John took when he didn't want to be seen walking home. The streetlights here were fewer, casting long shadows between patches of yellow light. The rain blurred everything beyond a few yards. It started as a low rumble, almost lost in the storm. Ranger froze, ears up. A second later, he barked, sharp, urgent. Not the half-hearted alert he gave to stray cats or rustling trash bags. This bark had weight to it, an edge that made John's pulse tick up. He stopped and squinted into the darkness. "What is it, boy?" Ranger had moved a few steps toward the tree line that bordered the park. His tail was stiff, his body leaning forward. Another bark cut through the rain, followed by a sound John couldn't quite place. Maybe the faint echo of movement, maybe just the wind slamming branches together. John frowned. It was late. It was pouring, and the cold was starting to creep into his bones. More than once, Ranger had chased noises only to find nothing but an empty alley or a raccoon darting off. This was probably no different. Still, there was something in the way Ranger stayed fixed on that spot. Head slightly lowered, rain streaming off his fur, that made John pause. His breath misted in the air as he debated: head home to warmth and quiet, or step into whatever waited in that darkness. The rain hammered harder on the hood of his jacket. He turned half away, ready to call Ranger back. "Come on, let's go," he muttered, his voice low, almost swallowed by the storm. But Ranger didn't move, and in the distance, beneath the steady roar of the rain, John thought he heard something else. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a small, stifled cry mixed with the steady drumming of rain. John's head turned sharply toward the tree line. Ranger stood stiff, amber eyes locked ahead, his chest rising and falling with short, deliberate breaths. John's military instincts flared. In Iraq, that kind of silence between sounds often meant trouble. He pushed his hood back for a better look, ignoring the cold rain sliding down the back of his neck. "Stay close," he muttered, more to himself than the dog, and stepped off the path. The mud sucked at his boots as he followed Ranger, the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves heavy in the air. The dog moved with purpose, head low, tail stiff, then slowed, as if approaching something fragile. A dim figure took shape under a flickering lamppost near the park's edge. At first, John thought it was just a bundle of discarded clothes, but then a small head moved. The girl couldn't have been more than 7, her thin arms wrapped around a faded, too small backpack. Her short-sleeved red shirt clung to her body, soaked through, the hem frayed. Mud streaked her bare legs, and her blonde hair hung in wet, matted tangles. Beside her lay a woman, motionless. Even in the weak light, John could see her pale skin, lips with a bluish tint, and soaked clothing plastered to a frame that looked far too thin. John dropped to one knee, his hand instinctively checking her pulse. Weak, but there. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, every exhale almost lost in the rain. The girl's wide blue eyes locked on him, filled with fear that looked far older than her years. "It's okay," John said quietly, his voice steady from years of knowing panic never helped. "I'm here to help." Ranger eased forward, lying down beside the girl, pressing his body against her side. She flinched at first, then buried her face into the thick fur, her small shoulders trembling. "What's your name?" John asked, keeping his tone soft. "Mia," she whispered, her voice scratchy from cold and crying. "That's my mom. She won't wake up." John's jaw tightened. He reached into his jacket pocket for his phone, fingers stiff from the cold, and dialed 911. The screen showed only one flickering bar of signal. He tried anyway, but the call dropped after a second. Cursing under his breath, he switched to text, typing a quick SOS to the town's emergency dispatch. Adult female unconscious, child present, Park East exit. Medical help needed. He hit send and prayed it went through. "Okay, Mia," he said, shrugging off his jacket and wrapping it around her small frame. The fabric swallowed her, but she clutched it tightly. "We're going to get your mom somewhere warm. Ranger's going to help." The dog stood, watching John with unblinking focus. Bending down, John slid one arm under the woman's back and the other beneath her knees. She was lighter than expected, alarmingly so. As he lifted, her head rolled limply against his shoulder. The rain stung his face, but he kept moving. "Stay close, Mia," he said, glancing at the girl. She clung to his sleeve, Ranger keeping to her side like a silent guard. The parking lot was a block away, but each step felt longer under the weight of the woman and the knowledge that her life was slipping. Mia stumbled once, and Ranger nudged her forward with his nose, never breaking stride. At the truck, John opened the rear door and laid the woman across the seat, grabbing an old wool blanket from behind the driver's seat to wrap around her. Mia climbed in beside her mother, still clutching the backpack, her knees drawn to her chest. Ranger jumped in after, curling up to block the wind from them. John slid behind the wheel and started the engine, the heater roaring to life. As the truck lurched forward, he heard Mia's small voice from the back. "She's not gonna die, right?" He caught her gaze in the rearview mirror, eyes wide, wet, and desperate. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure she doesn't," he said, forcing conviction into his tone. Inside, though, a tight knot of worry coiled in his chest. He could feel the chill radiating from the woman's body, even from the driver's seat. Hypothermia didn't give much time. The streets of Maple Hollow were nearly empty, the headlights cutting through sheets of rain. Every red light felt like an insult to urgency, but he didn't dare risk a crash. Ranger's head rested on Mia's lap, his eyes half closed, but ears still swiveling at every sound. The girl's hands were buried in his fur, holding on as if he were the last steady thing in her world. They pulled into the small medical clinic on the south side of town. John jumped out, yanked open the back door, and lifted the woman into his arms again. The clinic's front doors slid open, revealing a middle-aged nurse with curly brown hair pulled into a messy bun. Her name tag read, Linda Kay. She had kind hazel eyes, but a brisk, no-nonsense way of moving, like someone used to dealing with emergencies without wasting breath. "What happened?" she asked, already moving to help guide the woman onto a gurney. "Found her in the park with her daughter," John replied. "She's freezing. Pulse is weak. I think she's been out there a while." Linda's expression tightened. "Get her into room 2. We'll warm her up and get fluids started." "What's your name, hun?" she asked, turning to the girl. "Mia," the girl said softly, glancing at her mother as nurses wheeled her away. "And your mom's name?" Linda asked. "Laura Harris," Mia answered, the syllables barely escaping her lips. Linda scribbled it down, then turned to John. "We'll take it from here. You brought them in just in time." John nodded, exhaling for what felt like the first time in 10 minutes. He stepped back to let the staff work, but stayed close enough to answer questions. Ranger sat patiently at his side, dripping onto the linoleum floor, his eyes following Mia as she watched the door where her mother had disappeared. The rain had slowed by morning, but gray clouds still hung low over Maple Hollow, pressing the small clinic into a quiet hush. The hallway outside Laura Harris's room smelled faintly of disinfectant and damp wool, as if the storm had seeped in overnight and decided to stay. John sat in a hard-back chair just inside the doorway, elbows resting on his knees, his broad frame hunched forward. His damp work jacket was draped over the chair beside him, and Ranger lay stretched out on the tile floor at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes fixed on the hospital bed. Laura lay still, a pale figure beneath the thin blanket. Up close, she looked younger than John had first thought, 34 maybe, but her skin was drawn tight across high cheekbones, and the hollows under her eyes spoke of more than just one night in the cold. Her dark brown hair, tangled and still damp from the night before, framed her face in uneven strands. The IV tube in her arm carried a slow drip of clear fluid into her body, and a monitor beeped steadily in the background. Dr. Meredith Cole entered quietly, a tall, slender woman in her late 40s with light skin and straight, graying hair pulled into a low ponytail. She had a measured way of speaking, as though weighing each word before letting it out. Her years in small-town medicine had given her a calm, almost unshakable demeanor, but the faint crease between her brows hinted at concern. "She's stable for now," Meredith said, stepping closer to check Laura's vitals. "Severe dehydration, hypothermia, and physical exhaustion. From what I can tell, she hasn't had a proper meal in several days." She adjusted the IV drip and added, "If she'd been out there another hour, I'm not sure we'd be having this conversation." Mia sat in the corner on a padded bench, hugging her faded backpack to her chest. She wore a borrowed sweater, oversized, navy blue, with the clinic's logo on the sleeve, that made her look even smaller. Her blonde hair, now brushed out by one of the nurses, still carried the faint scent of rain. She had the solemn gaze of a child who'd learned too early that comfort was fleeting. John glanced over. "You holding up okay?" His voice was quiet, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile calm in the room. Mia nodded, then looked down, her fingers twisting the frayed straps of the backpack. We were staying at a motel," she began, her words halting. "It wasn't nice. The lights didn't always work, and it smelled like smoke. Mom said it was all we could afford." Her voice cracked on the last word. John leaned back, giving her space. He'd seen enough to know that pressing for details too soon could shut a person down. Mia's eyes darted toward him, then to the window, where rain traced thin lines down the glass. "The man who owned it, Gary. Mom called him Mr. Gary when he was around, but when he left, she'd just call him Gary. He got mad a lot. Sometimes he yelled at me if I made noise. Said I was lucky he even let us stay there." She swallowed hard. "Yesterday he told us we had to leave. Mom tried to tell him we had nowhere else to go. He just said it wasn't his problem." Ranger lifted his head, ears pricking as if he sensed the shift in Mia's voice. The girl reached down and touched the dog's fur, her small hand resting against his warm coat. John caught the flicker of fear in her expression when she said Gary's name. It wasn't just the memory of being thrown out. It was the kind of fear that lingered, deep and constant. He wanted to ask what had happened before that night, but the way she tightened her grip on Ranger told him it wasn't the right moment. The door opened slightly, and Nurse Linda Kay peeked in. "She's sleeping soundly now," she said softly, referring to Laura. "We'll keep her under observation for the next 24 hours. You can stay if you like." She glanced at Ranger. "And your friend here seems to have made himself part of the care team." John managed a faint smile. "He doesn't leave people he thinks need protecting." True to that, Ranger had barely moved since they arrived. He stayed pressed close to the hospital bed, occasionally shifting to glance at Mia, as if to remind her he was still there. His steady presence seemed to be the only thing keeping her shoulders from curling in completely. As the morning wore on, the quiet rhythm of the clinic settled in, distant phones ringing, the squeak of rubber soles on tile, the occasional murmur of nurses. Mia sat by her mother's bed, talking in a low voice that John couldn't quite make out. Every so often, Ranger would nudge her hand with his nose, earning a faint smile from the girl. When lunchtime came, Linda brought in a tray, soup, crackers, and a small carton of milk for Mia. The girl hesitated until Ranger settled beside her, then began to eat in small, careful bites. John watched her for a moment, thinking about the gulf between a warm meal in a safe room and a wet night on the street. It was a gulf he knew all too well. The wind had shifted by afternoon, carrying with it the metallic scent of more rain. From the narrow clinic window, John could see the clouds dragging low over the rooftops of Maple Hollow, their heavy underbellies threatening to split open again. Inside, the air was warm, but heavy with the faint tang of antiseptic and boiled coffee. Dr. Meredith Cole entered the room with her usual quiet grace, her gray-streaked hair pulled back neatly. She carried a clipboard tucked under her arm and wore the same calm expression she had the night before, though her voice had the kind of firmness that suggested a difficult truth was coming. "John," she began, glancing briefly toward Laura, who was now propped up slightly on the bed, her dark hair combed back by Nurse Linda. "We've stabilized her as best we can, but this facility isn't equipped for long-term recovery. With the main road to Harrisburg flooded, transferring her to a larger hospital isn't an option for at least 2 or 3 days." John understood immediately what she wasn't saying. The clinic could keep Laura alive, but not in comfort, not with the kind of quiet care she would need to truly regain her strength. He looked over at Mia, who was perched in the corner chair, her small hands wrapped around a plastic cup of juice. Her blonde hair was still slightly damp from the morning's wash, her face pale against the navy sweater she wore. She wasn't listening to Meredith's words, but her eyes kept darting toward her mother, as if willing her to stay awake. "What are you suggesting?" John asked. Meredith hesitated. Given the weather and her condition, she needs somewhere warm, safe, and quiet. Somewhere she can rest without the constant noise of this place. "If you—" She trailed off, her gaze shifting to Ranger, lying obediently at John's feet. "I know you live alone, and you seem capable." John leaned back in his chair. The idea was logical, but it twisted something in his gut. He'd built his life into a fortress of solitude since coming home from the war. Letting someone in, 2 people, wasn't just about opening his front door. It was about breaking the quiet he'd fought to keep. But then he looked at Mia again, at the way she tightened her arms around herself when the wind outside rattled the clinic windows. "All right," he said finally, his voice low. "They can come with me." Laura, still weak, tried to protest. "We can't impose—" Her voice was barely above a whisper, roughened by dehydration. "It's not an imposition," John said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his tone. "It's just a couple of days until the road's clear. Then you can decide your next step." By the time the discharge papers were signed, the rain had begun again, light but persistent. John helped Laura into his truck, her steps slow and unsteady. Mia climbed in after her, clutching her backpack, while Ranger hopped into the back seat without needing a command. The drive back to John's house wound through narrow streets where puddles reflected the orange glow of early evening streetlights. His house sat on the edge of the town, a modest single story with chipped blue paint and a porch that creaked when you stepped on the 3rd plank. It wasn't much, but it was his. As soon as they pulled into the driveway, the curtain in the front window of the nearest neighbor's house twitched. John caught the movement in his peripheral vision, but didn't comment. He helped Laura up the steps, one arm steadying her, while Mia stayed close behind. Ranger trotted ahead to the door, tail low, but wagging faintly as if sensing a shift in his territory. Inside, the living room smelled faintly of motor oil and pine from the old wood-burning stove. John had cleared the clutter off the couch earlier that week, but it still looked lived in. Worn leather chairs, a coffee table with a few scratches, a rug faded from years of sun through the front window. He showed Laura to the couch and brought out extra blankets from the linen closet. "It's not fancy," he said, "but it's warm." As Mia wandered cautiously toward the kitchen doorway, the faint crunch of gravel outside caught Ranger's attention. The dog's ears pricked, and he moved to the window, his gaze sharp. John followed, spotting 2 neighbors, Mr. Clayton, a retired mail carrier with a fondness for gossip, and Mrs. Webb, a petite woman with silver hair and a sharp tongue, walking slowly past, their eyes flicking toward his porch. By the time John stepped outside to grab an extra log for the stove, he could hear the faint, carrying tone of Mrs. Webb's voice. "Brought home a woman and a child, in this weather? You'd think he'd know better." He didn't bother to respond, just closed the door behind him with a quiet finality. Let them talk. Back inside, Ranger was still at the window, tail twitching once before he returned to Laura's side. The dog sat close, eyes scanning the room, muscles taut. Every time a car passed on the street, his head turned, ears forward. Is he always like that? Mia asked softly, her small fingers tracing the edge of his ear. John smiled faintly. Only when he thinks there's something to watch out for. Mia nodded, as if the explanation made perfect sense. She leaned against Ranger, and the dog didn't move, only shifted slightly to press closer. Later, as John stoked the stove, the faint echo of Mrs. Webb's voice drifted into his mind again. He shook it off. This wasn't about them. The next couple of days would be about keeping the fire going, making sure Laura stayed warm, and maybe, just maybe, letting a little noise back into a life that had been quiet for far too long. And as Ranger moved to sit at the front door, his body a living sentinel against the night, John felt the unfamiliar but steady pull of responsibility anchor itself deeper in his chest. The morning light in Maple Hollow was pale and watery, filtering weakly through the lace curtains of John's living room. The wood stove gave off a low, steady heat, filling the space with the faint scent of pine. John was in the kitchen, pouring coffee into a chipped white mug, when he heard a quiet rustle from the couch. Laura Harris was stirring. She blinked slowly, her dark eyes darting across the unfamiliar room before landing on the folded blankets over her legs. Her posture tensed, and her gaze flicked toward the doorway as though gauging her chances of getting out. The lines of exhaustion on her face were stark in the soft daylight, and her thin frame looked even more fragile now that the damp from the storm was gone. John stepped into view, keeping his voice low and calm. "You're safe. This is my place. I found you and your daughter in the park last night. Ranger here made sure I didn't walk past." Ranger, lying by the couch with his head on his paws, thumped his tail once in quiet acknowledgement. His amber eyes never left Laura's face. Laura's gaze softened for a moment, then wavered. She pushed a strand of hair, still a little tangled, behind her ear. "I remember the rain, and Mia crying. I thought—" Her voice caught, and she looked down at her hands, fingers tightening into pale fists. "I thought we weren't going to make it." John pulled up a chair, sitting across from her. "You were hypothermic, dehydrated. The clinic got you stable, but with the roads flooded, they couldn't keep you there long. So, you're here until you're well enough to figure out your next step." She swallowed hard, the tendons in her neck tightening. "You don't know what you've brought into your home?" He frowned. "Then tell me." For a long moment, the only sound was the pop and crack of the stove. Laura's eyes brimmed, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I was working at a roadside diner outside Harrisburg when Gary showed up. He's the kind of man who smiles in public but keeps his fists clenched behind closed doors. Tall, broad, shaved head, always wearing that leather jacket like he owns every place he walks into. He offered me a cheap room at a motel he ran and said he could get me more shifts there. At first, it seemed like a chance to start over." She gave a humorless laugh. "Then the debt started showing up. Things I never signed for, fees for repairs that never happened. He told me I owed him, and until I paid it off, I worked for him." John's jaw tightened. He'd met men like Gary overseas, different country, same rot inside. Laura's voice cracked now. "Mia wasn't spared. He'd make her run errands for the other tenants, clean the front steps, even scrub the laundry room. Said it was to teach her responsibility. But really, it was to take the rent off my hands. Rent I could never seem to pay in full because of his fees." Ranger lifted his head, ears pricking at the tension in Laura's tone. As her words came faster, her breathing quickened, and her voice trembled. The dog gave a sharp bark, startling Mia, who was sitting cross-legged on the rug with her faded backpack in her lap. Mia looked over at her mother, then at John. "That's why we had to leave. Gary said, if we didn't, he'd—" Her voice faded, and she pressed her face into Ranger's neck. John leaned forward. "Did he hurt either of you?" Laura shook her head quickly, but the movement was too quick, the kind that meant the truth was more complicated than the word no allowed. "Not yet, but he wanted more control. He started talking about how I needed to work off the debt in ways I won't repeat in front of Mia. That's when I grabbed what little we had and left. We walked until my legs gave out." Ranger let out another low bark, moving closer to John's chair. His gaze was fixed toward the window, his muscles taut. John followed his eyes, but saw nothing beyond the drifting snowflakes. Still, the hair on the back of his neck prickled. "You think he'd come looking?" John asked. Laura hesitated, then nodded once. Gary doesn't let go of anything he thinks belongs to him, especially when it makes him money. John's mind was already shifting into the old patterns, scanning threats, thinking of angles, planning exits. He glanced at Ranger, who was still staring toward the yard. "We'll deal with that if it happens." Mia peeked up from where she sat with Ranger, her blue eyes uncertain but searching. "You won't let him take us back, right?" John held her gaze. "Not while you're under my roof." For the first time since she'd woken, Laura's shoulders eased slightly, but her eyes still carried the wary light of someone who knew safety could vanish in an instant. Outside, the snow fell in slow, quiet spirals, but in the warm living room, an unspoken understanding settled between them. This wasn't over, and Gary might already be closer than they thought. The wind had shifted again, bringing with it the brittle cold that settled deep into the bones of Maple Hollow. By midnight, the town was silent, save for the occasional creak of frozen branches or the distant groan of ice shifting on the rooftops. Inside John's small house, the wood stove burned low, casting a faint orange glow across the living room, where Laura and Mia slept under thick quilts. John sat at the kitchen table, nursing a mug of coffee gone cold. His thoughts had been circling all evening, tracing over Laura's story, Gary's name, and the possibility that the man wouldn't give up. He'd been a soldier too long not to trust his instincts. When someone like Gary lost control, they usually came looking to get it back. Ranger lay sprawled by the front door, his head resting on his paws. His eyes were half closed, but his ears twitched at every sound. Just past 1 a.m, they pricked sharply, his head lifting in one smooth motion. A low rumble rose from his throat. John's back straightened. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. The rumble deepened into a growl, then a sharp, urgent bark. Ranger rose to his feet, his thick black and tan coat bristling, and moved to stand directly between the door and the sleeping figures in the living room. The dog's stance was rigid, tail low, his amber eyes fixed on something beyond the frosted window. John moved quietly to the door, peering through the narrow gap in the curtain. At first, all he saw was darkness. Then a shadow moved across the snowy yard, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a leather jacket that seemed to swallow the light. 2 other shapes lingered behind him, one lanky with a hunched posture, the other heavy-set with a shaved head. The tall man stepped forward into the porch light. Even through the glass, John recognized him immediately. Gary. His mouth curved into something that might have passed for a smile, if not for the cold glint in his eyes. John opened the door just enough to step outside, the cold biting at his face. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice low but steady. Gary spread his hands, a gesture that was meant to look harmless but radiated menace. "Relax, Miller. I'm just here for what's mine." His voice was smooth, almost conversational, but each word carried a subtle threat. "They're not yours," John said flatly, "and you need to leave, now." The heavyset man shifted his weight, his boots crunching in the snow, but Gary didn't move. "Laura owes me," Gary said, his tone tightening. "She walked out with my property, both of them. I don't think I need to explain the kind of trouble that brings." From inside, a soft sound, Laura's voice, barely audible, floated toward the doorway. She must have woken to Ranger's barking. Ranger growled louder now, the sound vibrating through the air as he planted himself fully in front of the door, ready to lunge if the man stepped closer. "Go back to your truck," John said, stepping forward just enough to close the distance between them. The porch light caught the lines in his face, the square set of his jaw, and the faint shadow of stubble that made his steel-gray eyes look even colder. "You take one more step, and I'll make sure the law is involved." Gary's smile thinned. "You think the law scares me? I've dealt with worse." His gaze flicked past John toward the inside of the house. "I'll get back what's mine sooner or later. Might as well save us both the trouble." John's hand tightened on the door frame. "If you try, you'll regret it." The lanky man shifted, muttering something under his breath. Gary gave him a sharp look, then stepped back. "This isn't over," he said, his voice dropping to a near growl. "You can't hide them forever." John watched them retreat toward a dark pickup truck parked at the edge of the road. The engine roared to life, tires spitting slush as they pulled away into the night. Once the sound faded, John stepped back inside, locking the door and drawing the curtain. Ranger stayed by the door, still alert, his ears swiveling as if tracking echoes of the confrontation. Laura was sitting up on the couch, her face pale but her eyes sharp. "He was here, wasn't he?" she asked, her voice low. John nodded. "He won't stop. But I'm not going to let him take you or Mia." She swallowed hard, then looked toward her daughter, still asleep under the blankets. "You don't know what he's capable of." "I've seen men like him," John replied, "and I've stopped them before." When Laura didn't respond, John crossed the room to the old rotary phone mounted on the wall. He dialed a number from memory. After 2 rings, a deep voice answered. "Caleb," John said. "It's Miller." Caleb Hart was a man John had known since his second tour overseas. Back then a sharp-eyed military police sergeant, now the police chief of Maple Hollow. In his late 40s, Caleb was broad and solid, with a short beard peppered with gray, and eyes that missed nothing. His voice was calm, deliberate, the voice of a man used to diffusing trouble before it exploded. "Long time," Caleb said. "What's going on?" "Gary Parker. He was at my place tonight with 2 others. Made it clear he wants Laura and Mia back. I need you to keep an eye out." On the other end, Caleb exhaled slowly. "Yeah, I've heard about him. Not much I can do without a complaint, but I can make sure patrol swings by your place more than usual." "That's all I'm asking for now," John said. "Just, watch him." "I will," Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave. "And John, don't let him push you into doing something that'll land you on my desk." John allowed himself a small smile. "No promises." After hanging up, John returned to the living room. Ranger had settled down again but kept his head up, watching the door. John sat in the armchair opposite Laura, the unspoken weight of the night pressing between them. Gary was out there, and the message was clear. He'd be back. 2 days after Gary's visit to John's porch, Maple Hollow's air carried a tension that seemed to seep into every corner of the small town. It wasn't the storm anymore. The snow had eased into a brittle crust under a pale winter sun, but rather the quiet undercurrent of something about to break. Caleb Hart had kept his word. Since John's late-night call, patrol cars had been swinging by the house more often, and Caleb himself had stopped in twice, once in uniform, once in plain clothes, to check on Laura and Mia. In both visits, he'd kept his tone light, but his eyes had the sharp, measuring look of a man who never really turned off the part of his mind that cataloged threats. On the 3rd morning, Caleb called John from his office at the small red brick police station downtown. "We've got an opening," he said, his voice brisk but tinged with satisfaction. "Gary's making a move this afternoon. We've got someone wired and ready." That someone was Deputy Sarah Lennox, a woman in her mid-30s with a lean, athletic build and a steady presence that came from years of undercover work. She had shoulder-length dark auburn hair, often tied back in a low ponytail, a pale complexion that contrasted sharply with her green eyes, and a dry, understated humor that made her a favorite among the patrol officers. She'd been posing for the past week as a tenant in one of Gary's other rundown properties, letting him believe she was in trouble with rent and open to alternative arrangements. John listened as Caleb laid out the plan. Sarah had arranged to meet Gary at the back office of the motel, where Laura and Mia had stayed, ostensibly to settle her debt. What Gary didn't know was that the room would be wired with cameras, and officers would be in position nearby. By early afternoon, the trap was set. John didn't go. Caleb made it clear that the best thing he could do was stay with Laura and Mia, but that didn't stop him from pacing his living room, the phone clutched in his hand. Ranger followed him step for step, the dog's head tilting at the sharp turns John made across the rug. Across town, Sarah arrived at the motel. The place looked even more run down in daylight, peeling paint, sagging gutters, and a flickering neon vacancy sign that buzzed faintly in the cold air. Gary met her in the doorway of the office, his leather jacket zipped to the neck, his smile wide but his eyes hard. Inside, the office smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap coffee. Gary leaned against the counter, shuffling a stack of papers. "You know how this works," he said smoothly, sliding a document toward her. "Sign here, and we can forget all about the cash. Just means you'll owe me some work until we're square." Sarah glanced down at the paper, a fabricated debt agreement with vague labor terms, before looking up with feigned hesitation. "This isn't legal, is it?" she asked, her tone cautious but tinged with nervous laughter. Gary's smile didn't falter, but his voice dropped a notch. "Legal's not really the point, sweetheart. The point is keeping a roof over your head." He leaned in, pen in hand. "Sign it." That was the moment Caleb had been waiting for. From their position in an unmarked SUV parked down the block, he gave the order. Officers moved fast, 2 through the front, 1 through the side door, catching Gary mid-lean over the counter. The heavyset man who'd been with him at John's place was in the back room, and he didn't have time to run before a uniformed deputy stepped in to cuff him. Caleb himself entered last, his presence filling the small office. "Gary Parker, you're under arrest for coercion, fraud, and assault-related charges," he said, his voice calm but carrying the authority of someone who'd done this 100 times. Gary's expression flickered between outrage and disbelief. "This is a setup," he spat. But Sarah's calm removal of a small microphone from inside her jacket silenced any further protest. By late evening, John's phone rang. It was Caleb, and this time his tone carried the satisfaction of a clean arrest. "We've got him on tape, Miller. Coercion, debt fraud, prior assault complaints we didn't have leverage on before. It's enough to put him away for a good while. Laura and Mia are officially in the clear. We've already connected them to the state's Victim Protection Fund, housing, counseling, whatever they need." John glanced over at Laura, who was sitting at the kitchen table with Mia, helping the girl with a puzzle they'd started that morning. The relief on her face when he relayed Caleb's words was almost physical, her shoulders lowering, her eyes finally holding something other than constant vigilance. Mia, hearing her mother's voice steady for the first time in days, smiled and leaned into her side. 2 days later, a letter arrived from the Victim Protection Office, offering financial assistance for relocation and living expenses. There was also a note from Caleb, hand-signed, confirming Gary's formal charges and upcoming court date. The fund also came with an optional monetary reward for John, an acknowledgement for his role in sheltering and protecting Laura and Mia until the arrest. John folded the letter and set it aside without answering. Money wasn't why he'd opened his door that night in the rain. Instead, he kept Caleb's number pinned to the fridge, knowing the sheriff would take his call any time, and quietly made a note to check in with the lawyer assigned to Laura's case to ensure the system didn't lose sight of her and Mia once the trial began. Justice had been served, but John knew better than most that justice didn't always mean the danger was gone. The pale light of early March slipped over Maple Hollow, melting patches of old snow into dark, wet earth. The storms had passed, but the air still carried that crisp bite that made you pull your jacket a little tighter. John Miller stood at the porch railing, a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching Ranger trot in slow arcs across the yard. The dog, with his thick black and tan coat and steady, intelligent gaze, seemed more relaxed these days. His job wasn't over, but the edge of constant alertness had softened into something like contentment. It had been a month since Gary's arrest, and the rhythm of life had changed in ways John hadn't expected. Laura Harris, now with healthier color in her cheeks, her once gaunt frame filling out again, had found steady work at Marlowe's Bakery on Main Street. She wore her brown hair in a loose braid most days, and flour often dusted her sleeves by the time she returned home. The job suited her. Early mornings, a friendly crew, and a place where her quiet resilience was valued. Mia had started attending Maple Hollow Elementary, just 2 blocks from the bakery. The first week, she'd clung to Laura's hand at the school gate, her blue eyes wide and uncertain. But Ranger's presence, waiting faithfully outside each afternoon, became her anchor. Now, she bounded out of the building at the end of the day, her messy blonde hair catching the sunlight, backpack bouncing, to throw her arms around the dog's neck. John had learned more about the two of them in these weeks. Laura had grown up in a small steel town and left home at 19 to escape a controlling stepfather. Her strength was quiet but unyielding. She had the kind of voice that could calm a room without raising above a murmur. Mia, for her part, was cautious around strangers, but quick to laugh once trust was earned, her sense of humor surprisingly sharp for a 7-year-old. As for John, the solitude he'd once guarded so fiercely had been invaded, gently but completely. The sound of the front door opening in the late afternoon, the smell of fresh bread Laura sometimes brought home, the clatter of Mia's crayons at the kitchen table, all of it had replaced the hollow quiet that used to fill his evenings. He realized, almost with a start, that he no longer sat in the dark with the TV off. One evening, Laura invited him to the bakery after closing. The air inside was warm, heavy with the scent of sugar and yeast. Marlowe, the owner, was a short, round man in his late 50s with thinning hair and a booming laugh. He shook John's hand with the firm grip of someone used to early mornings and long hours. "She's a hard worker," he said, nodding toward Laura with obvious respect. "And that little girl of hers, sharp as a tack. You've done them a good turn." John brushed it off, but he felt something loosen in his chest as he watched Laura smile, really smile, for the first time since that night in the rain. The days settled into an unspoken routine. John fixed things around the house while Laura cooked more often than she let on, and Mia roped him into helping with her school projects. Ranger seemed to sense that the danger had passed, though he never stopped walking Mia home from school, tail high and steps measured. Then came the evening that sealed what they had become. The sun was low, painting the clouds in streaks of rose and gold. The four of them, John, Laura, Mia, and Ranger, sat on the front porch. A simple dinner was spread on the small wooden table, warm bread from the bakery, soup John had made, and a jar of pickles someone had left on the doorstep as a thank you. They ate slowly, talking about little things. The spring fair that was coming to town, Mia's art project, how Ranger had chased a squirrel up the fence that afternoon. Laura's laughter was soft but steady, and Mia leaned against John's side as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Ranger lay at their feet, his ears twitching at the sounds of the quiet street. As the light faded, John realized something he hadn't dared put into words before. It didn't matter that they weren't bound by blood. That night in the rain had rewritten the lines of his life. They weren't just three people and a dog sharing a house anymore. They were a family, stitched together by choice, by gratitude, and by the simple, stubborn fact that they'd held on to one another when the storm tried to take them apart. And for the first time in years, John didn't feel alone. Sometimes, miracles don't come as blinding flashes of light or thunder from the heavens. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, on a rain-soaked night, in the form of a stranger who doesn't turn away, a loyal dog who refuses to leave, and a child's trembling hand reaching for safety. I believe God's hand was there in Maple Hollow that night, guiding John's steps, steadying Ranger's heart, and whispering hope into a storm that could have ended so differently. And maybe, just maybe, the same kind of miracle is waiting for someone you know, hidden in the ordinary streets, the passing faces, the moments you could choose to walk away, or to stop and care. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it so others might believe in kindness again. Comment below with where you're watching from. I want to see how far these stories travel. And if you believe that every act of love is a gift from God, hit the subscribe button so you never miss a reminder that light still exists in this world. May the Lord bless you, protect you, and keep your heart open, because you never know when you might be the miracle in someone else's storm.